chorus with me. Oh, Christ be magnified. And sing it, oh, Christ be magnified. Just let his praise arise. And Christ be magnified in me. Sing it, oh, Christ be magnified from the altar of my life. And Christ be magnified in me. And when every creature finds its inmost melody, and every human heart its native cry in one, and then in one enraptured hymn of praise we'll sing, Christ be magnified. Be magnified in us, Lord. Sing it up. Christ be magnified in me. Sing it, oh, Christ be magnified from the altar of my life. Christ be magnified in me. Everything I have is yours. Surrender. Here at your feet, Father. Sing this with me. I won't bow to idols. And I won't bow to idols. I'll stand strong and worship you. And if it puts me through the fire, I'll rejoice
his teeth. May we with faith run to Calvary. Not one shed tear, no strand of grief falls to the ground and goes unseen. Death is defeated and Jesus reigns. Tell the world there is hope in his name. He pushed back the darkness, he conquered our sin. Christ will make all things new again. Christ will make all things new again. New again. We're blinded by trials, our lives marked with pain. Shadows surround us, but there's hope today. When sorrow runs deep and the night is long, may we find peace in the Savior's song. Death is defeated, it's Jesus reigns. But tell the world there is hope in his name. He pushed back the darkness, he conquered our sin. In Christ will make all things new again. In Christ will make all things new again. New again. The sun, it is dawning, it pierces the night, it cuts through the shadows with redemption's light. The fallen will rise, the weak will be strong, yet death turns to life in our Savior's arms. Death is defeated and Jesus reigns. Tell the world there is hope in his name. He pushed back the darkness, he conquered our sin. In Christ will make all things new again. Ooh, death is defeated and Jesus reigns. And tell the world there is hope in his name.
Good evening, Calvary and friends. My name is Christy Spader. I am the director for women's ministries here at Calvary Memorial Church, and also going to be help moderate this evening tonight. But we are so glad that you have joined us for this evening, whether you heard about this from social media, from a friend, a neighbor, whether you've been attending Calvary for some time now. We're grateful that you chose to spend your Sunday evening and invest this evening to have a really important dialogue together. This night is part of a larger sermon series that we just started this morning called For the Love of the World, talking about Christian sexuality and gender. And this is a particularly special additional opportunity for us to dive a bit deeper into a very complex topic, an aspect of has Christianity been good for women? And this topic is personal for many of us in this room. And each one of us is bringing with us to this conversation perhaps our different faith journeys, our perspectives, our experiences, some positive, perhaps some negative, perhaps some just neutral. But we hope that tonight we provide a space for us to hear, to dialogue about this weighty but important topic. But I wanted to kind of survey the evening for you to let you know what is coming up. So first, we'll get a chance to hear from Gerald on this very topic. But then afterwards, we will be joined with us a panel of women as well as Gerald, and we'll have the opportunity both to hear from them and a few questions that we've prepared, as well as invite you to have the opportunity to ask your own questions for them. And so before we begin, I want to introduce our speaker that many of you may know, Gerald Heastan. So Reverend Dr. Gerald Heastan, wow, applause before. That's good. Reverend Dr. Gerald Heastan is the senior pastor of Calvary Memorial Church. He's been in pastoral ministry since 1999, serving in 3 different churches. He's the graduate of the University of Reading in the UK, where he completed a PhD in classical studies, looking at the relationship between Christianity and the Greco-Roman world. He has authored and edited a number of books. He has published a number of scholarly articles. He is the co-founder of the Center for Pastor Theologians, and Gerald lives here in Oak Park with his wife and his 4 children. So, would you now welcome with me Reverend Dr. Gerald Heastan.
Good evening, everybody. I don't know if you all, because you're the first service people and the second service people mingling together, probably fighting over your normal seats. I don't know if you're all getting along with each other okay, but it's good to see you all. I've got a 45-minute talk prepared, and I don't typically practice my talks, but I was worried about this one being too long, so I did practice it, and it was 45 minutes. But now I didn't practice this part that I'm saying right now, so maybe we're up to 46 minutes now. But yeah, I thank you for being here tonight. It's good. And if you're not a normal attender of Calvary, we're super glad that you're here. And this is an important conversation for us just to be thinking through and talking about as a congregation at this time. So, all right. Let me just say at the outset, as we get going here, that I am not an expert on gender studies. This is not an area that I have published on extensively, nor do I have deep lived experience as a woman, as you can see. But as a pastor, I am occupationally responsible to give a coherent account of the Christian religion in relation to pressing cultural issues. And the question of women's rights and flourishing certainly is a relevant and pressing cultural issue, especially for our congregation here at Calvary, situated as it is in Oak Park. And Oak Park is, as many of you know, if you've lived in Oak Park or just been in and around the surrounding areas, it's quite progressive on questions of women's equality, rights, and flourishing. And I should just say up front at the front end that I am feminist in orientation and supportive of women's equality, rights, and flourishing. And women have made laudable progress over the past 100 years or so, And I'm sure that all of us here tonight are quite happy about that. But the topic this evening is not feminism for or against. The topic this evening before us is, what is Christianity's relationship to the feminist cause? How has Christianity done in respect to the flourishing of women? Or as the title of our talk, has Christianity been good for women? And so here I feel a bit more on familiar ground, because while I don't know a lot about what it is to be a woman, I do know a fair bit about Christian theology and the history of Christianity. So my thesis this evening is that Christianity indeed has been good for women. Now, I recognize that this claim, particularly in the broader culture, is not without controversy. And on the whole, the larger feminist culture in North America tells us that Christianity, especially the more traditional varieties of Christianity, so Roman Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, conservative forms of Protestantism, in the main have been obstacles to women's progress and obstacles to ethnic minorities and the poor, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Generally speaking, the more progressive a social context, the less inclined it is to view Christianity as a force for good in the world, such that generally speaking, in communities like Oak Park, there is a tendency to have a suspicious posture towards more traditional forms of Christianity. So my aim this evening is to challenge that thinking and to argue that Christianity has been a force for good for women when considered in the aggregate and on the long historical view, and that Christianity carries within itself a feminist impulse that is actually more responsible for the flourishing of women than its secular counterpart. Or I could state my claim, perhaps provocatively in this way: Christianity has been more feminist than feminism. All right, so here's how this argument that I'm going to lay out is going to unfold. It's going to be in 4 parts. In the first part, I'm going to take a step back and look at the roots of Western history and look at the world that Christianity was born into, the Greco-Roman world of the first century. And I want us to get a picture of what life was like for women in that world. And then in the second part of my talk, I want to note the key moves that Christianity made regarding sex and marriage that challenged and critiqued the Greco-Roman worldview of women. And then these moves, I will suggest, amounted to essentially a Christian sexual revolution in the first century. Then in the third part, I want to offer a few thoughts on the results of this Christian sexual revolution throughout history. And then I want to conclude by comparing the Christian sexual revolution of the first century with the secular sexual revolution of the 20th century. All right, so that's where we're looking to go over the next number of minutes. So part 1, Rome and women. Christianity was born into the tumult of the Roman Empire, which was itself deeply steeped in the long-standing Greco-Roman views of gender and power. So very briefly, let me just note some of the relevant aspects of this Greco-Roman worldview insofar as it relates to this evening's topic. First, the Roman culture was strongly patriarchal. Male Roman citizens were in the power position, and generally speaking, women had rights only insofar as they were related to a male Roman citizen, primarily their husband or their father. They could control their own property, which generally entailed the dowry that they brought with them into the marriage, but they had no legal authority over their children. The wife was expected to manage the household affairs, but the father of the family, called the paterfamilias, the head of household, was the one who had sole legal authority over all the affairs of the house and over the children. The paterfamilias was like the emperor of his own home. He had even the authority to put his children to death. So when a baby would be born in a Roman home, it would be placed traditionally on the floor. If the paterfamilias picked it up, that would be the designation that the child would be kept as a member of the family. If he did not, it would be exposed, meaning it would be left outside to the elements to be either die by the elements or to be picked up by slavers who would use it in slavery. So the ideal Roman woman was quiet and uneventful, and the less one knew about a man or a man's wife or daughter, the more the wife or daughter was living into the Roman ideal. Women could not vote or serve in any kind of public life. They were given a limited education and were not generally taught to write. And because property rights passed through inheritance, I mean, that happens today, but even more so in the Roman world, passed through inheritance from a man to his sons, Female chastity was highly prized. Men were concerned to know that they were passing their property rights down to their legitimate offspring. And they couldn't be sure of this if they didn't keep an eye on their women, was the logic. As such, women's lives were highly regulated by their families, and women did not typically go out into the public unescorted. And in the Roman world, wives were generally not valued by their husbands for love or for companionship or even for sex. They were valued primarily for procreation and their ability to manage the affairs of the household. Many Roman men did not especially care for their wives. I don't want to overstate that because I'm sure there were some happy, contented marriages in the Roman world, but it was often the case that men did not especially care for their wives and had as little sex with them as possible, only what was necessary to keep the family line going. For sex and companionship, men often looked outside the marriage, which meant that regarding chastity, there was a clear and unapologetic double standard in the Roman world. Chastity for women meant only having sex with your husband. But men, single or married, could have sex with whoever they wanted, whenever they wanted, provided they didn't transgress the guardianship or the ownership rights of another man, meaning the woman's father, her husband, her slave master. So mistresses, prostitutes, and a man's own slave girls or boys were socially acceptable for men in their sexual appetites. Indeed, the idea of male chastity and continence wasn't even a thing in the Roman world. Plutarch, a Roman philosopher from the 2nd century, he gives us a somewhat distressing picture of this double standard. He wrote a book called Conjugal Precepts that served as a sort of marriage manual, advice to young married couples. So here's his advice that he gives to young brides. The lawful wives of the Persian kings sit beside them at dinner and eat with them. But when the kings wish to be merry and get drunk, they send their wives away and send for their music girls and concubines. They are right in what they do because they do not concede any share of their licentiousness and debauchery to their wedded wives. If therefore a man in private life who is incontinent and dissolute in regard to his pleasures commits some peccadillo with a lover or maidservant, his wedded wife ought not to be indignant or angry, but she should reason that it is because of his respect for her that he shares his debauchery, licentiousness, and wantonness with another woman. So I don't know how that logic would work today. That is because of my respect for you, dear, that I have taken my attentions elsewhere. And finally, perhaps most disturbing, there were no laws against rape per se in the Roman culture. The laws against rape and sexual assault in the Roman culture were related to the citizenship rights of the man to whom the woman belonged, or the boy, or the slave. So a sexual assault upon a wife, or a sister, or a daughter, or a slave was a punishable offense, but only insofar as it was a crime against the male citizen. But a sexual assault upon a woman, or a boy, or a beggar, or a prostitute who had no male protector or guardian was not considered a crime in the Roman world. Now, I don't want to convey that life for women in the Roman world was at every point a misery, or that sexual assault happened at every turn. If a woman was part of a decent family, primarily decent means wealthy, so the more wealth, the more decent the family, that could afford meaningful protection for women. But women from poorer families, or women who were female slaves, and at the time of the Roman Empire in the 1st century, slavery comprised anywhere from 10 to 30%, scholars estimate, of the Roman population. So half of those would be women. Or women from non-citizen families would fare worse. And it was this second class of women that constituted the vast majority of women in the Roman Empire in the 1st century. So what was clear in the Roman world to both men and women was that it was a man's world and that it was men who had all of the dignity and all of the rights. So this is the context into which Christianity is born. It's a highly patriarchal context that left women often marginalized and oppressed. All right, so now let's consider Christianity and women, part 2. As we consider the Christian account of women, we have to look into the New Testament, and we can begin with the perspective of the Apostle Paul. Now, for those who may not know, Paul was one of the earliest apostles of Jesus and was chiefly responsible for spreading the message of Christianity out into the Greco-Roman world. So the message of Christianity took heart immediately in Judaism, which is where it came out of, but its progress into the Greco-Roman world comes through the Apostle Paul. So we want to hear what Paul has to say in his engagement with the Greco-Roman world on the topic of women. In Paul's letter to the church in Ephesus, he provides the following account of marriage. And this is the text that we looked at if you were here in church this morning. He says, "Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. Now as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. In the same way, husbands should love their own wives as their bodies, should love their wives as their own bodies, and he who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is profound, and I'm saying that it refers to Christ and the church. However, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband." Now, there are a number of things to note here in this passage. First, Paul likens the relationship between the husband and wife to the relationship between a head and a body. The husband and wife represent an organic whole. They are interdependent on each other. They rise and fall together. Now, the head-body metaphor was not exclusive to the Apostle Paul. In the Roman context, the emperor was the head and the state was the body. And in the Roman mind, the function of the body was to protect the head. That was the whole point of the army of the state, but of the state more generally. And sometimes the body had to die to protect the head. But Paul inverts this logic and says that the head exists for the sake of the body. In the Christian conception of marriage, the husband's goal in marriage as the head of the body is the body's flourishing. Her good, not his good, is the chief end of marriage. And this is true in Christian marriages, even if the husband has to give up his life for the sake of his wife. And what this meant was that in the Christian view, the wife was not an expendable appendage to be tossed aside when no longer suiting the purposes of the husband. Even a barren wife in Christian marriages could not be set aside, which in the Roman mind, that would have not made sense at all, because the point of a wife was procreation and passing on the family line. But Christianity said, no, you can't divorce your wife just because she's barren. The Christian husband was to regard his wife as his own flesh and to pursue her flourishing above all others, including his own. And most significantly, Paul grounds this vision of marriage in his understanding of the relationship between Christ and the church. For Paul, human marriage was a living picture of God's sacred plan of salvation. Human marriage, he says in verse 32, refers to Christ and the church. So in the Christian account of salvation, God so loved humanity that he entered into a one-spirit covenant with humanity that was the archetypal reality of which the one-flesh covenant of human marriage was an image. So this is why historically, throughout the history of Christianity and in the remainder of the New Testament, the church has conceived of itself as the bride of Christ, and why the scriptures prophesy that the end of all the ages, there will be a great wedding feast, and this great wedding feast will be a feast in which heaven and earth are united together in a cosmic marriage. Paul is saying that human marriage was ordained by God from the very beginning to forecast and reveal the unity and sacrificial love that Jesus has for his people and the trust that his people have for him. So for Paul, the sanctity of marriage is tied to the sanctity of what it represents. But there's more that can be said here. In the Christian account of salvation, Jesus not only marries humanity, but he raises humanity up and seats humanity with him in the heavenly places. And we could look back and read passages from earlier in Paul's letter to Ephesus. Which is to say that the story of Christianity is the story of how God came to earth in the person of Jesus, died a sacrificial death on behalf of his beloved, united himself to her, and then raised her up to sit with him in his place of dignity and authority over all creation. So the basic message that Christianity had to Roman men was, see how Christ cares for, honors, and exalts the church? Go and do likewise with your wives. And wives, for their part, were called to respectfully accept this sacrificial love from their husbands. And this basic Christ and the church framework governed all Christian sexual ethics in three key ways. So first, divorce, which was quite common in the Greco-Roman world, and permissible even in the Judaism out of which Christianity came, was no longer permissible for Christians. In Christianity, marriage, as an expression of Christ's devotion to the church, was once and for all and could only be broken by death or in extreme cases of infidelity. Social historians have made the point that this level of fidelity to marriage had never been tried before. Even Jesus' first disciples were shocked by it when he told them. And if you've read Luke's gospel, you would see this instance. Second, chastity was now binding on men just as much as it was binding on women. No more mistresses, no more prostitutes, no more slave girls or slave boys. And this wasn't just the rule for married men. Not even single Christian men could take a mistress or visit the prostitutes or have a slave boy or girl. In the new Christian sexual ethic, the only viable and legitimate outlet for male or for female sexual expression was now in the covenant of marriage, which explains why Paul had to tell the newly converted Gentile Christians who are living in Corinth in 1 Corinthians chapter 6 that they had to stop visiting the prostitutes because that wasn't a no-brainer for them. Third, Paul insisted, you see this in 1 Corinthians 7, that the sexual rights and pleasures of the marriage bed were to be enjoyed equally by both the husband and the wife. Sex was holy, sacred, and a profound sign of spiritual union between Christ and the church. And thus it was for husbands and wives equally. Neither was allowed to deny the other the proper conjugal rights of marriage. So Christianity strove for sexual equality between women and men, not by loosening the boundaries of sexual propriety for women, but by tightening the boundaries of sexual propriety for men. In many respects, Christianity required Roman men to adhere to the same basic boundaries that Roman women had been adhering to all along. No sex except with your spouse. But while it constricted male sexual activity, it actually gave more freedom and affirmation to female marital sexual activity. No longer was sex only for procreation. It was now to be enjoyed by both husband and wives mutually. And all of this amounted to a radically different and fundamentally more pro-woman sexual ethic. Indeed, it is not too far off to call this a sexual revolution. Now, the term revolution implies a quick and rapid change, and that wasn't the case with the Christian sexual revolution because it was started very small. But though it moved slowly, it was certainly revolutionizing for the Roman world. So now we move into part 3 and looking at the result of the dropping of this Christian sexual ethic into the Greco-Roman culture. Christianity's new sexual ethic and commitment to marriage was, as I've mentioned, unheard of and had never been tried before. And it was seemingly contrary to all natural male impulses. But for all of that, Roman men began to convert. At first, the Christian sexual ethic was adhered to by only a very small minority within the Roman world because Christianity started off very small. But by the start of the 4th century, Christianity had become so pervasive in the Roman culture that it was formally adopted as the religion of the Roman Empire. And along with the spread and the rise of Christianity came the spread and the rise of its sexual ethic. And the greatest beneficiaries of this new Christian sexual ethic were women and slaves and children, all those who were most likely to be tyrannized by unrestrained male sexuality. In an ancient Roman world where it was socially permissible for men to do as they pleased without respect for the dignity of women, Jesus, and then the Apostle Paul, insisted that male power must be restrained, and when deployed, it must be deployed in the service of women. Women, not just as men, Christianity insisted, were co-heirs of the kingdom of God. Female sexuality was to be honored, not exploited. And as St. Paul's message of chastity and continence traveled throughout the Roman Empire, women less and less had to fear male sexual tyranny. Women increasingly were viewed within the Christianizing Roman culture as having dignity in their own right, not merely because they were attached to an influential or significant man. Sexual relations within marriage became more and more filled with reciprocity. Wives less and less had to fear being divorced if they couldn't conceive, or only useful for procreative sex and then left sexually isolated until the following year. Roman wives less and less had to share their husband's sexuality with other women or young boys or slaves. The prostitution was viewed less and less as a legitimate option for male sexual desire, which meant that less and less female prostitutes were forced to expose their infants or attempt to raise their children as single mothers, which was a nearly impossible task that doomed both the women and their children in the Roman culture. Taken in the main, the sexual power of the Roman male culture, which had once been deployed in service of self, began to turn ever slowly at first in service of women. And this benefited women as a whole in the Roman culture, not just the Christian women, because Christianity was teaching the Roman culture, and men not least, that all women were the bride of Jesus and were the daughters of God. That all women had dignity and value regardless of social station, class, or association with a powerful man. Now let me introduce here at this point a work that's been very influential for me in this area, or an author, is Tom Holland. All the kids down here are very excited. It's not the Tom Holland of Spider-Man fame, I'm sorry to say. But he is British, and he's an Oxford historian who's done a fair bit of work on the Greco-Roman world. And he's recently written a book called Dominion, The Making of the Western Mind. Now, I should say that Holland is progressive, politically left. He is not a Christian. But he has set himself out to figuring out how did we get from the patriarchal and violent Greco-Roman world to the more pacific, democratic, and more feminist world of today. I was listening to him in a podcast, and he was commenting how he very much likes the world we live in today far more than the Greco-Roman world. He says the Greco-Roman world is very fascinating, but so are great white sharks, and you wouldn't want to swim with one. So he says, I write about that, but I would rather live in this world. And so he was thinking as a historian, how do we get from there to here? And so he set himself out on what sounds like a decade-long quest of trying to connect the storyline. And that's what his book is, Dominion, The Making of the Western Mind. And in his book, he argues at length that the dominant influence in the Western tradition, the animating force that gives rise to all the ideals that are so hallowed in the classical political Western tradition, ideals like fairness and compassion and equality for women and racial minorities, that the animating influence has been Christianity. Christianity, Holland argues, has rewritten the script about the proper use of power. Jesus' sacrificial example, his life and his death, taught his followers, who then taught the world, that power was to be used in service of not of the self, but of the other, and most especially those who were vulnerable and oppressed. Holland's claim is that Christianity was like a depth charger, dropped beneath the surface of the turbulent Roman world that has sent shock waves rippling throughout the Western world for the past 2,000 years. And in the final chapter of his very large book, Holland applies this central thesis on power, and he's covering a lot of ground beyond just gender and women. But he applies this central thesis particularly to the issue of women. He draws particular attention to the Me Too movement that really got underway in 2018. The logic of Me Too was that males, especially those in positions of power, should not use their sexual power to tyrannize over women, and that if they did, the larger culture should stand up and defend the women who had been victimized. And that is exactly the Christian view of things, Holland points out. It was certainly not the old Roman view. Holland points out that the old Roman world was full of Harvey Weinsteins. But women without male guardians never could make complaints. They could not voice their concerns and their victimization because no one cared in that world. But today it's different. Victimized women can voice their concerns not just to their husbands or their fathers, but to the larger culture. And countless male heads have rolled as a result. And that never could have happened, Holland points out, in the Roman world. The Me Too movement, Holland says, succeeded precisely because Christianity has taught Western culture that men should control their sexual power and treat women with dignity and respect, and that if they fail to do so, justice should be served by the culture on behalf of the victimized women. So Holland states this in his book. He says, 2,000 years of Christian sexual morality has resulted in men as well as women widely taking the sanctity of the female body for granted. Had it not, then Me Too would have had no force. The irony, Holland notes, is that so many who protested at the Me Too rallies viewed Christianity as the generative source of women's oppression, when in fact, he says, it has been Christianity that has been insisting for the past 2,000 years that men need to chastise their sexual powers and that they need to respect the sanctity of female bodies, and has been warning ill-behaving men that if they somehow evade human justice in this matter, they will not evade God's justice. And all of this gradual progress towards women's liberation is precisely how Jesus taught us to expect Christianity to work. At a number of points in his teachings in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus says that the kingdom of God is like a small mustard seed that a man plants in a garden, but it grows over time to become a mighty tree that shelters many birds. Or that the kingdom of God is like leaven that a woman puts into 3 measures of flour until the whole dough is full of the leaven. And Jesus' point in both cases is that the kingdom of God would start small, but it would grow over time to what would permeate the entire whole. And so it has. Slowly but surely, the Christian sexual ethic has been steadily unraveling the ugly sweater of draconian male power that once dominated the West. And not only has this meant that women have been increasingly, not perfectly for sure, but increasingly freed from male oppression. Perhaps even more significantly, women have been freed up to make significant and meaningful contributions to the larger society that have benefited both women and men. So the fact that today we have, for the first time in our nation's history, a female vice president, we have female Supreme Court justices, female business leaders, female doctors, female psychiatrists, female professors, and so on, all bringing their unique female perspectives to vital cultural roles, is the long-term consequence of the Christian vision for female flourishing. Now let me finish out this talk with part 4, and as I get into part 4, I want to offer kind of 2 final thoughts related to part 4 as we compare the Christian sexual evolution with the contemporary modern sexual evolution. So first, the Christianization of the world, we need to say, is a project that is still in process. So I am not claiming tonight, I don't want to be understood as claiming tonight, nor do Christians generally claim that Christianity has made the world just right for women. Christians believe that the world is better off because of Christianity, but we do not believe that the world is as it should be. More work remains to be done. So imagine a patient who is sick with some sort of a bacterial infection, has all the symptoms of this infection, and the patient goes to the doctor who prescribes a powerful antibiotic, strong enough to cure the patient. Now, antibiotics do not reverse the sickness in a single moment, nor do they work overnight. But if one stays with the physician's prescribed regimen, one will make steady progress. And human culture, I would submit to us all, is like a sick patient. And Christianity is like the antibiotic that has been prescribed by God to cure humanity of our many ills, not least our inherent misogyny and totalizing patriarchy. The antibiotic of Christianity is still at work and has not completely cured human culture. So we grant that, and it's important to acknowledge that. But if we zoom back and we consider the long view, we can see that the feminizing and healing power of Christianity has been profound in the West. Nowhere else in the world, and at no other time in human history, have women been afforded the kind of inherent dignity, freedoms, respect, and opportunities that we find in the Western Christian tradition. Where else would we look, besides the Christian West, for something that valorizes and shows the dignity of women? China, Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan, Iran, India. So I'm not suggesting that Christianity has completely healed the patient, nor that humanity reached its feminist peak in 1950. And all we need to do now is try to get back to the golden days of Ward and June Cleaver. And weren't those the happy days? 1950 was not the goal of Christianity's feminism. It was just another step in the process of treating a sick patient. 1950 was better than 1850, which was better than 1750, which was better than 1650, and so on. But there remains more feminizing, culture-shaping work for Christianity to do. And I think the best days of Christian feminism lie in the future. So now here's my concluding point and the primary purpose that I was animated to give this talk. The West is losing its faith in the feminist power of Christianity. Starting in earnest in the 1960s, Western culture began to paint Christianity as the villain of the feminist story, a patriarchal force that needed to be shoved aside so we could better get on with the feminist cause. And this, I would contend, has been a mistake. And I'm not the only one who thinks this. Louise Perry is a feminist writer, and she's written a new book called The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. Now, Perry, like Tom Holland, is not a Christian, as far as I know. She is certainly not a conservative. She's also British, so I seem to like my British authors. But she is against traditional religion. She's pro-LGBTQ. She's in favor of abortion and contraception. But she's a very witty writer, and she's a columnist who campaigns against male sexual violence. But Perry's feminism and her feminist impulses has inspired her to level a devastating critique against the sexual revolution. According to Perry, the feminist complaint that led up to the sexual revolution went something like this: men get to have sex whenever they want and never have to worry about the consequences. That's a double standard, and it's not fair. Women should be able to have sex like men. But the problem was, Perry acknowledges, is that women couldn't have sex like men because if they did, there was a good chance that they would end up pregnant. And there was, prior to the sexual revolution, no available contraception that women could use reliably, and there was no access to safe abortions. But then the advent of the pill in the 1960s and the legalization of abortion in 1973 gave women the technological capability to pursue this vision of having sex like men, and the sexual revolution was born. But Perry contends, despite the widespread availability of contraception and the legalization of abortion, the sexual liberation for women has been a disaster. So here's just a few stats. From 1940 to 1960, the out-of-wedlock births in America, in the US, hovered right around 5%, sometimes 4, sometimes 6, up and down, but right around 5% from 1940 to 1960. 1940 is as early as our records go, apparently, on out-of-wedlock births. But beginning in 1960, the out-of-wedlock births hockey sticked up to now over 40%, where it stands today. So today, nearly half of all children born in the US are born to a single mom. And Perry points out, and this is common knowledge to social scientists, that the quickest pathway to poverty, the most reliable pathway to poverty for a woman, is to be a single mom. In 2021, there were over 15 million single moms in the US. And whole generations of women have been pulled down into poverty, and their children along with them, because of sexual liberation. And abortion, which no one on either side of the debates thinks is a good thing, has skyrocketed, of course, since the sexual revolution as well. And to date, there have been over 63 million abortions in the U.S. And Perry goes on to point out how the rise of porn and the mainstreaming of BDSM that comes along with the rise of porn and then mixed up with the hookup culture has been especially harmful, in particular to women. She points out that only about 8% of women and 33% of men have a high sociosexuality. And sociosexuality, I am told by Perry, actually measures the degree to which a person enjoys non-relational sex. So only 8% of women and only 33% of men have a high enough sociosexuality that they enjoy non-relational sex. But the vast majority of women, 92%, and a significant majority of men, 67%, don't want to simply have hookup sex with someone that they met that night in a bar. They want to actually have a relationship. But the entire hookup culture actually caters to the sexual preferences of the worst kinds of male sexuality, the 33%, that have the least amount of regard for what the vast majority of women prefer, leaving the vast majority of women and the majority of men largely dissatisfied with the status quo and bereft of romantic relationships. So do you know who pumped their fists and cheered at the idea of the sexual revolution? There's the 33% of men with high sociosexuality who happily approach sex without regard for the consequences that it has to women. The liberal feminist project, Perry says, has valorized having sex like a man as the pathway to women's liberation. But in Perry's view, men who have sex without regard for consequences are assholes. And her whole book is asking the question, why do women want to be able to have sex like assholes? It's a very good question. Indeed, she calls for men to stop looking at porn, to say no to BDSM, to restrain their sexuality around women, and she exhorts her fellow women to drop out of the hookup culture, avoid one-night stands, and generally stop sleeping around so much. Monogamous marriage, she says, needs to make a recovery and become supported and anchored by tougher anti-divorce laws, because monogamous marriages are the best environment for raising children and produce the most stable economic cultures overall. And as I said, Perry is not a Christian, and I'm not sure if she even is aware that her moral framework comes strikingly close to St. Paul's vision of Christian sexual ethics. Maybe she would be distressed to find this out. She writes, a truly feminist project would demand that men, not women, should adjust their sexual appetites. And there is a deep irony here, because the Christian sexual revolution of the first century sought equality between men and women by asking Roman men to adjust their sexuality to match the more naturally restrained sexuality of Roman women. But the modern sexual revolution seeks equality between men and women by encouraging modern women to adjust their sexuality to match the more naturally unrestrained sexuality of men. Or we could say it like this: the Christian sexual revolution asks unchaste men to model their sexual behavior after chaste women. The modern sexual revolution asks chaste women to model their sexual behavior after unchaste men. And the proof, I think, is in the pudding. The Christian approach to equality has been making steady improvements for women for the past 2,000 years. It has stabilized society, has granted new dignity and opportunities to women, and it penalizes powerful men who tyrannize and misuse their sexual powers. Whereas the feminist approach to equality has been, I would suggest, a destabilizing force for women and their children for the past 60 years. Despite the widespread availability of contraception, the sexual revolution has resulted in tens of millions of abortions and millions of single moms who are sliding into or are in danger of sliding into poverty with their children. So to my Christian brothers and sisters who are concerned about the cause of women in the world, I say to you, as a Christian and as your pastor, so am I. Don't lose faith in Christianity's feminist vision of chastity, marriage, and sexuality. It has been working, slowly to be true, not perfectly in every way yet, but it has been transforming Western culture. And to give up now is to give up on the only thing that has worked in Western human history, perhaps arguably in all of human history. I don't know enough of human history to make that claim quite yet. To bring about a culture-wide freedom and liberation for women. The boundaries to which Christianity mutually calls both men and women alike are life-giving for both, but they're most especially life-giving for women. To my non-Christian friends, I invite you to consider that Christianity, whatever the culture may tell you, is indeed truly concerned with the flourishing of women and is earnestly striving for this very thing. And finally, the last thing I will say to all of us is that God loves us. He loves us, and he's dedicated to making the world a better place for women and for children, for sexual and ethnic minorities, for all people. Thank you for your attention. Yes, thank you. I do want to, Chris.
All right, thank you, Gerald, so much. As you can see, we've been joined up here by several women as well, and so I want to, before we move forward, just to introduce these wonderful women who are sitting on the stage with us, who will have a few moments to share in just a minute or two. So first, on your right is Ray Paul. So Ray is the managing director for the Center for Pastor Theologians. She holds a bachelor's in theology from Moody Bible Institute and is currently pursuing a master's in systematic theology from Trinity International University in Divinity School. Alongside her role with the CPT, she serves as a ministry associate for adult education at Calvary Memorial, and she's attended here since 2015. Thank you, Ray, for being here. We also have Debbie Berkey next to Ray Paul. She is the Associate Director of Development for Hope International, which pursues Christ-centered poverty alleviation around the world. Debbie Berkey has been very invested in women's ministries for a number of years, is a mom of 4, a grandma of 12, and has attended Calvary for over 30 years, it sounds like. Almost 30 years. So we're really glad to have Debbie with us as well. And then finally, we have Louisa Olushoga. Yes, we've been working on it.
Just like that.
She's a psychiatrist at Lawndale Christian Center, where she's been for the last 2 years, received her bachelor's degree from Dartmouth College and a medical degree from University of Illinois. Her psychiatric and subspecialty training were completed at University of Chicago and Northwestern University, respectively. She specializes in reproductive psychiatry and works closely with women within the context of trauma. An East Coast native, she now resides in River Forest with her husband and 3 daughters, and she's attended Calvary since 2014. So we're really excited for all 3 of you. Thank you so much for being here. Yes, absolutely. These are intelligent and wise women. I'm so thrilled that we get to hear from them. They have been asked to do this not as experts on this topic per se, nor do they come speaking on behalf of their organizations, but they care deeply about women's flourishing and Christian flourishing and how to best integrate our Christian faith into those spaces. So we'll hear from them in just a moment. But before we do, I want to have the opportunity just to turn back to Gerald and ask a question for him based on kind of what you shared this evening, which thank you so much for your willingness to engage this topic and kind of take us through a journey of Christian history from your expertise with Greco-Roman culture. But one thing that we talked about a little bit, but you've made the argument that Christianity is inherently feminist in orientation. So what about the different times when Christians themselves have stood in the way of progress? Like the Christian men and pastors who opposed women getting to vote in the 1920s, or opposed women moving into the workforce. Would you be willing to comment on that for us?
I will give it a shot. Yeah. No, and I think that's a very fair question, because I'm trying to give a narrative that highlights the way that Christianity has been good for women. But I would maybe, to go back to my analogy of the antibiotic, so God has handed the antibiotic down to the church to give to the world. It's like the church is like the doctor, right? But doctors can have the right antibiotic and also have a whole lot of other kind of quack medicine stuff around too. So I think there's a lot of ways that the church and then the broader culture hasn't always made good use of the antibiotic, but I don't think it changes the fact that the antibiotic itself, Christianity, has been working its way for good. So I might have a high bacterial infection, I go to my doctor, and he gives me the right antibiotic, and he also tells me to take ice baths and to stand on my head and to eat spinach. Like, none of those have anything to do, but the antibiotic still works, right? So I think there's a lot of things that have been involved in Christianity that are not helpful to women, that have stood in the way of things. But the Christian gospel itself, Christianity itself, I think has been what women have needed in the broader culture.
Thank you. Thanks for that. All right. I'd love to kind of open it up just to you three women. And as we do that, this next section will be an opportunity for you in the audience to ask questions both to Gerald or to the panel that are up here. And so how this will work is that we will have, as you can see, 2 mics that are up front. And so if you'd be willing to come down to the front, say your name, and ask your question, and just for the sake of wanting to get to as many questions as possible, it could be helpful to have your question written down on a piece of paper in front of you for you to read out, or be as brief and clear as you can as you get to your question. But I'm going to take some time to ask these women a question, and as you hear or listen, feel free to start lining up at these microphones. So, Louisa, Debbie, and Ray, each one of you have been leaders in your own fields of occupation, and you had the chance to read Gerald's message prior to tonight. And so I'd love to hear, this isn't the first time you've had the chance to listen to this. What were your general thoughts or impressions? What parts maybe resonated with you? What parts maybe are you less sure about, or perhaps even disagree with as you heard Gerald or read his thoughts? We can go one by one, but I'd love to hear from all of you. So whoever wants to go first, go for it.
Hear it. Knew this was going to happen. So I have to admit, when the title of the talk was first introduced, my gut was, has Christianity been good for women? Yes. Has it been good for me as a woman? No. So I would put myself as an asterisk in the category initially. And from talking to some of you, I know that's true for you as well, where you can say broadly, in the wide sweep of history, we affirm it. And then there's a host of the ways in which it has not necessarily been true for us. But I think I was struck again, even having read this and hearing it again, first of all, of how hard dignity is to come by in any other system. Because when you attempt to establish what is the worth of a woman or what is the worth of humanity, you always have outliers who don't meet the frame that you're trying to establish. And the fact that Christianity has a narrative for the oppressed and the outliers and sort of the margins is really striking to me, again, when in taking that step back. I think the one other piece that struck me anew, even in hearing it, was the fact that the surrender of our definitions and categories of things like freedom or power, it's not merely when looking at sort of the Christian scope that you say, well, it works in this way. It also tinkers with our definitions of our own limits. I think of that in relationship to women. Some of the impulses of even the feminist waves, some of the ways that they've attempted to rewrite power or freedom have actually worked, I think, in harm, and definitely realizing Christianity takes all of those and excavates them and turns them over. And even my willingness as a woman to allow my definition of freedom, to allow my own limits to at what point do I surrender to those? At what point do I attempt to overcome them? And to have sex like a man, as sort of that, as Perry identifies in her work. Just that whole, it is a total frame is striking me anew, even in ways perhaps I don't want yet. So.
Hi, it's good to be here, and I guess I would agree that it's in my mind. I'm able to say yes and affirm this is true. Christianity is good for women, but experientially also it's been good. But I've also experienced hurt, even within the context of the church, and so I know it to be not just a simple response that doesn't take into account the kind of vulnerability that women have and some of the abuses within even the church that are very real. I want to say that I really appreciate the space that we have that's been created here at Calvary to name this, to have this conversation. I appreciate your posture, Gerald, and I would say the staff and elders at Calvary to listen, to desire to find what's the best for the flock here, because I think it's easy for fear to prevail, both for men feeling fearful of what it might mean for women to flourish, to experience power, and women experiencing fear on the other side as well. I think that I would say I resonate, I agree with all that has been laid out, that it's congruent with who I know Jesus to be, someone who radically valued and lifted up women, all the way from Mary, the mother of Jesus, Jesus being born in a womb, the woman at the well, women who were marginalized, women who were despised because of their condition, how he responded to them, the woman caught in adultery, the woman with a chronic bleeding condition, that it strikes me that Jesus stood up to the powers that be, which were not just Roman, but were religious as well. And I find that to be very powerful. I think that I have seen this force for good with Christianity in a really profound way in the 9 years or so that I've been working for a Christian nonprofit that works with those who are the most marginalized around the world, those who have been systemically marginalized and taken advantage of, and those who need, those who are who have experienced this kind of disregard, and I think it's what is telling for me. There are many pieces of this, but I'll just say one of them is that in leaning into these kind of individuals in 20 countries around the world, not in the United States, but around the world, in countries that reflect really more of the Greco-Roman, still today, more of the culture that you described is still very prevalent in other parts of the world. To see what this good medicine is able to do, but also to see that as we lean into the least of these and those that need it the most, that 70% of the clients that Hope serves around the world are women. So they continue to be very vulnerable. What is encouraging to me there, where I see the church or Christianity shining, is several ways. I'm a fundraiser, so I'm able to see that thousands of individuals that are believers in the United States consider it a priority to prioritize the least of these and prioritize women who are victimized around the world. I am heartened as well to see the response of the church around the world. So Hope works currently with 27 church denominations and about 10,000 local churches, where each of these communities empower women to be able to not only support themselves through work, but also informs them that they have God-given dignity because they are image bearers of God, and is able to lift them up, support them in lifting them up. And each of these communities where these churches are and where this ministry is are like, I would say, outposts of conversion and inversion in terms of this power dynamic that you talked about, Gerald. And I'll just say an example where I had the privilege in May of going to Malawi and was able to visit a savings group that was part of a church-sponsored savings group that was focused specifically on young girls who had become pregnant out of wedlock and had been kicked out of their homes, ejected from their homes, and also were no longer able to go to school. And this group was targeted in a good way by the local church and encouraged to meet together. And there was the beautiful picture that I have of that meeting where a savings group facilitator was pouring into them and lifting up their dignity, and we sat on the floor and heard them testify to the power of the gospel in their lives, to the difference that it made, to experience the life-giving power of Jesus Christ, to have advocates in the church who stood up for them. And so through tears, and this is a story that's repeated over and over and over again. So the good medicine, although there are many examples, sadly, where the church hasn't intervened, but still the good medicine is being given, and there is a dramatic impact around the world through Christianity, this powerful message of dignity and hope and freedom that I've been able to experience and see firsthand.
I think that both in reading and listening to the talk tonight, I think the part that has hit me most and probably has been most helpful, let me generally say, I agree, okay. The part that has hit me and been most helpful is this piece about understanding that we haven't quite gotten there yet, that we're still working on it. I think that sometimes it gets packaged as we've gotten it all right, but that feels so drastically short of what the reality is. And so this idea and this understanding that we haven't quite hit there yet actually feels a little comforting, because it feels like, oh yes, we understand there's a space, there's a places that we still need to go, that we're not done yet. As I was reading, and listening to Gerald tonight, I'm like, right, cool, right. And I'm thinking, I feel like Gerald and two British authors got the memo, and the church, we're still sitting here trying to figure this out, right? And sometimes I feel like that's what it is, right? And even in my work day to day, as I walk alongside women, I've had the pleasure of moving through both academic spaces and community healthcare spaces, both professionally, personally. It's hard because it really feels like the church, big C, has been, the perpetrator of some of the biggest and most profound ways that we've fallen short here. And so to then in the same sentence talk about how Christianity has been good for women, it's a hard pill to swallow, but the reality is, and I think that's what was so helpful with how the talk was laid out tonight, is that there is what Christ intended, and then there's the rest of us who kind of screw it all up, right? And so putting it in that space really allows us to lean into what the intention is, right? And where we've come from, certainly, in the same ways that we still live in a patriarchal and racist society, we've come from something, though. And it does feel like the way I'm living and where I'm living and how I'm living is the worst it's ever been. But the reality is, it's not, it's not. Years ago, I couldn't stand in front of you as a woman, as a black woman, to be a psychiatrist, let alone anyone, right, that could be holding a microphone. And so that's powerful. So I think it's been both helpful to hear that there is a prescription that we're still trying to work through, that we haven't quite met our full potential, and to even just be in a space where at least we get what the idea is, right? When I sit in front of my patients, and you might not have come on board with what we think the treatment plan is, but we're moving forward in your understanding why you might need treatment. And that's a step in the right direction. And similarly to what Debbie said, I'm grateful for this space to be able to talk through some of this.
Thank you guys so much. All right, we want to take some time to open it up for you guys in the audience to be able to ask questions both to Gerald and to the women on the panel. And so feel free to just come up and I'll point to you. So I'd love, just say your name and ask your question.
My name is Mike, and I am thrilled. I think this is fabulous what you've done tonight, and just want to say that to begin with. My question is for Louisa, Debbie, and for Ray. Recently, my wife and I came from another church, and inevitably people say, well, where are you going now? And we say we attend Calvary. And I'd say a good 20 to 30% of those we say, why would you ever do that? We would never go there. They don't respect women. They don't allow women on the board of elders. And how could you go to a place that doesn't respect women enough to have them on the board of elders? And so I wonder if we kind of miss it even with little c, even with our own organization here. And for Debbie, for you, and for Ray and Louisa, how do you feel about that? Can we be respecting all of the things we say and honoring the dignity, freedom, respect, honor, and value of women, and yet still say women have no place on the board of elders and the leadership in this church? And the more poignant point that someone once said to me was, we're probably missing people. Mike, that church is missing people. If they don't have a voice on the board of elders, they're missing the ability to reach the women that they otherwise could be reaching. So a lot of different components of that, but for Ray and for Debbie and Louisa, how do you feel about that?
This must be the question. The question.
How do you feel about that, ladies?
Well, this is what I would say. I have been here at Calvary for 8 years, and and I stand in front of you again as a woman, very much in leadership. Raising 3 beautiful girls. And I should say my background, I grew up in a Roman Catholic background, right? So there was also a different framework there that I worked through. I will say this. I'll say it in an analogy, because I think this is actually a bigger topic and a whole other paper. I will often have patients who come into me with a sense of what their diagnosis is, but also what the prescription's supposed to be, right? And they've come to me for my clinical and professional opinion, but when I give it, they're like, well, no, I've heard of this other thing. I want to try that first. And there are very specific reasons why I may not want to go that route first. Side effects, data, whatever, There's a reason why I want to do it this specific way, and that's why I feel like my clinical judgment pushes me. And I've had patients not come back because of it, right? Because they walked in with knowing what their diagnosis was, but also knowing what they needed the treatment to be. And I think of it very similarly. I think that, unfortunately, there's a lot of doors that get closed to even the conversation, right? I love sort of being in spaces where we don't all agree, but spaces where we can all talk about what it is that we don't agree about, right? And I think that a lot of people, and similarly, right, who I've had conversation with, we can sit down and kind of wrestle with this idea of women in leadership, women on the board of elders, and walk away and be like, I'm comfortable with it or I'm not comfortable with it, and there's still a place and there's still Jesus-loving, Christ-centered work that is happening here in Calvary. And I think sometimes we take these issues and these topics, and it overshadows like what Christ's work is. And so I would say that, I have been here and have continued to be comfortable here at Calvary. I've never felt as though, obviously, my voice has been like minimized. In fact, I've been in spaces where there have been women in leadership, on the pulpit, on the board of elders, where I've been less valued as far as what I have to say, or where the topics that I think are important are less discussed. So I don't think the math is as simple, even though we reduce it to be really, really simple. I'll leave it there.
Cool. Anyone else?
I'll just say that what I've found, because of being someone who's been in leadership and also in leading Bible studies and so forth for women, that there have been points along the way where I think I've wrestled with what it is about my teaching or my leadership that might be offensive or not to men, and the importance not only of women's voice in leadership, but women being heard by men in the congregation as well, and so their participation in that. I think that what I have found at Calvary is that my voice is valued, and also that the focus of the conversations that I've had, especially with Gerald, and I would really commend Gerald for opening this conversation with a group of women, in fact, that met for about a year during the pandemic, discussing a paper that he had about why he supports this philosophy or this doctrine, and the core of it is because he believes it's the best way for women to flourish and to be lifted up. And some of us wrestled, and I think continue to wrestle with that. But what my experience is that the commitment is to the flourishing of the women in this body. And I think there is an acknowledgement that there need to be more spaces when there are not places for a woman, say, on the elder board, that there need to be more spaces made for women and women's, what women have to say, to be offered and to be heard. And so I see the church working to make this more flourishing for men and for women, and I feel like I've been elevated here, and I also have experience too, I would say, in with those who say that they believe in women in leadership, and yet in their day-to-day, the experience of being lifted up or dignified is not there. So just wherever you fall on this doesn't necessarily mean that's the lived experience, I guess.
I'll just add one more thing, because I know this is part of a conversation that will continue. So also, I do want to signal that question is part of a stay tuned, come on February 11th, I feel like is a safe thing to say. One other thing I will say is that I, even for myself, want to be very careful about what categories I preemptively have set up as determining respect for myself as women. I come from a space where some of the churches I've been in, where you will never hear a woman speak at all. And so from the beginning to end of being in the house of the Lord, you will not hear a woman. And so I do count myself incredibly fortunate to be in this space, but I also recognize that I could have come from that position and said, unless I see a woman in the pulpit, I will count that as a sign of disrespect. And at that point, I've preemptively eliminated the ability to understand what's going on. So I want to be really careful of even my own categories of respect, my own understandings of power that are simply reactionary against ways it's gone wrong. And I want to say that for myself as a woman, and also perhaps for men of this whole, all of our definitions, even of freedom itself, have to be wrestled with. And to make them reactionary means that they dissolve very quickly into some unsustainable structures, where you have women on the board of elders, and you have as much dismissal and belittlement and marginalization, but you have the position that you've assumed equates with respect. So that's end of my soapbox.
Can I just say thank you, Mike, for that question? And it pains me to hear that 20% of the people that you talk to say, why would you go to Calvary? You know? So that's something I take seriously, and I know the staff would take seriously as well.
I'll throw in Mike too, and then for others, and Ray alluded to this, but on February 11th, this will be the question that we're going to address, so we won't try to solve it right now. So either leadership's not the right word because you all are leading right now, so we're not against women in leadership, clearly. And you're on staff, and you're on staff. Yeah. But women elders, women presbyters, that's a question. So either that's a holdover of our old patriarchal days and we still haven't, like the medicine hasn't worked yet, and that's something that needs to get rid of, or possibly that's actually the linchpin that secures the flourishing of women. And I'm going to be making that argument on February 11th. But we won't try to do that tonight.
Come on back.
Yeah, come on back for that. Yeah.
That was a teaser.
Yes.
Got it in.
If you squeeze the handle, yeah, it goes up and down, so it makes it a little easier.
Okay. Hi, I'm Whitney. So I've been thinking about this analogy you used of the antibiotic. And I've been thinking about how with antibiotics, usually it destroys everything in the gut. So like when you're introducing a new way of thinking, it leaves people very vulnerable sometimes. And so you have to be very intentional about introducing the good. And so I guess my question for the whole panel is, do you have practical ideas or advice for how do we teach dignity to women? How do we teach boys how to dignify women? How do we teach women how to dignify women? Yeah, that's my question.
I mean, I'll take a shot at it, and then I'm interested to hear your guys' thought. But I'm thinking of it, how do I teach boys to dignify women? I think the best way to teach boys to dignify women is when an older boy or man treats women with dignity, because then they see someone that they admire treating women with dignity, and then that is how they learn how to dignify women. So that's how I would answer it from a male perspective.
Oh boy, I don't know why I picked. Why I should have gone first. Something I've been thinking a lot about is what are the gifts to men and women that should be sought out and brought in. I work in a primarily male space, and that's been my work history across a number of industries. It's very common to be the only woman in the room. And so I'm very aware generally of who's also the other quietest voices in the room. And something that I wrestle with when I'm in those spaces or even here is, what are the gifts that a person has brought with their perspective that I need to seek out and to try to uphold? And I think that kind of, in a small way, asking, what are the gifts that are particular to womanhood that I can affirm as gifts that I then ask to be brought into the spaces where it most has the capacity to bring life? And what correspondingly are the gifts to men that I can ask and call out? Perhaps they're more visible from the start, that's possible. But what are the ways that I'm seeking out what might not initially, and sometimes it's because of the structures, the systems have been set out to keep them quieter, and I will acknowledge that. But I wanted to celebrate that there are things that are gifts particular to women, and I want to find that, and I want to encourage that as much as I want to for men, so.
Any other thoughts?
Just that I think that just as you would want to affirm older men displaying what it looks like for a boy to honor a woman or to have respect for her, dignify her, that I think it's important for maybe girls and for women, especially within the church, to model being speakers of being able to speak up when they have not been dignified, when they have not been treated with dignity. And I think it's difficult in a church that, in the context of submission sometimes, that becomes clouded or where the validity and the importance of women naming situations that are not just, where they have not had a voice, or where they are not being treated the way that they should be, even in the context of marriage. That needs to be something that we model, that still can fit within respect, can fit within the biblical model, but I think is really important and difficult sometimes for women to feel like they have enough worth and value to speak up for themselves. And so I would say that as well.
You know, I'm going to comment. Can I say one thing? I'm the moderator, but I'll say one thing. You know, I look at Jesus' example. He works so often with men and women on the fringes and marginalized, and those voices, those without dignity or the least among that culture. And the thing that I notice most about his example, that I'm constantly see and look at it when you read Jesus' example, is that he sees them. He acknowledges them. He is made aware of their presence. And I think there's something so beautiful as we teach those around them. The model that we give is we see and we acknowledge and we ask questions, a genuine curiosity for those who are on the fringes or are marginalized, or caring and give dignity to their personhood. So just a thought for there. Yes.
Hi, my name is Levin. I want to say thank you to Calvary and to everyone up there for doing this, talk. My question is regarding 1 Corinthians 7:8, where Paul says, paraphrasing, I wish everyone were single as I am, but if you must, marry. What do you think about what Paul says there for women in the aspect of marriage that sometimes have hurt women, and maybe it is better for them to be single? So yeah, my question basically is, what do you think about Paul says there in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, 6-8?
Okay, so do you want to jump in on that? I mean, that's a good question. We're going to be, so we'll be doing a podcast, I announced this morning, as part of this larger series, where we're going to talk specifically about singleness. But that's a good question, and maybe I don't know if I quite caught all of it, but I'll try to answer. So I think what Paul is talking about there when he says that I wish all men were as I am or could be as I am. He's single. Whether he's widowed, he's probably widowed, we think, but we don't know for certain. But he's single, and he's extolling in 1 Corinthians 7 the virtues of the single life, because he's able to dedicate himself more wholeheartedly to ministry to the Lord. And so he sees a value in singleness because he sees the ministry productivity that comes from it. But he doesn't recommend singleness for everybody. He's not trying to say everybody should be single. He's saying it's a good thing, and so he wants to hold it out as an option for people as it relates to ministry productivity, but not necessarily something for everyone. I think he sees marriage as more normative, and so he expects that most people will get married. In his culture, everyone got married. No one was single. Like, no one was doing the single thing in his day. So everyone was getting married. So he sees that as more normative, and he's giving instructions about marriages. But he wants to hold out singleness as a potential that someone should consider in service to the Lord. So I don't know if I've answered the question or not, but if not, come up and ask me afterwards, and I'll try to say more. So.
And we'll finish off with these two.
Hi, I'm Shelley. I have a question. Well, it's been alluded to a little bit in what's been said already, but I wanted to ask specifically. It's in two parts. So it was referred to in the talk about Christianity being unrightly blamed for standing in the way of women's rights and dignity. So my question is, as a Christian culture, have we ever warranted those accusations? Have we, as a Christian culture, properly shepherded and communicated this message to the church within and also outside? Like, what makes this miscommunication happen? Are we contributing to that in any way? And secondly, what can we do to share this redemptive message and make sure that it's communicated within the church and also outside the church? Thank you.
I'll maybe try answering the first thing, but I'm interested to hear your guys' thoughts on this. Is I think in using the analogy with the antibiotics and the doctor, Christianity, I maybe want to like put a little bit of separation between Christianity and the church, and recognize that the church is, in a sense, holding Christianity, is offering Christianity to the world. So the church is like the doctor, and the doctors sometimes do all sorts of crazy things, but it doesn't change the integrity of what is being offered out into the world, right? Sorry, doctor. It just kept going with it. Yeah, I mean, not all doctors do that. Yeah, okay, but I think so. I don't think we need to try to, when you talk to a non-Christian, we don't need to try to like lay claim that the church has never made any mistakes, that it's never done anything obstructionist, that its hands are clean entirely as it relates to the story of women. I mean, it's certainly not the case. It's certainly not the case related to race in North America or more broadly. So there's all sorts of ways that the doctor, as it were, hasn't always done a good job. But it doesn't change the integrity of the central antibiotic. So I think there are ways that we have, as Christians and as the church, we've messed up, and we should just own that when we've messed up and just acknowledge it, right? Because it's our Christianity that gives us the space to acknowledge the fact that we're not always good doctors, right? But it's the integrity of our message. So, but there was a second part to that question. I don't know if you remember it.
About the redemptive practices.
Oh, how do we model this or speak of it?
Model this to others within the church.
I'm interested to hear your guys' thoughts.
Yeah, and I think that's an ongoing conversation, right? And I think we're all still trying to work through what does it look like to model that broad. Because I would say, even in my work and in my practice, I just feel so strongly there's so little accountability and so little modeling of what it should look like. We can name, we could probably all name at least 3, if not more, stories or podcasts of how it has failed terribly, right? But we aren't good at modeling that, and I think we're still trying to figure that out. And on a personal note, I mentioned that I'm raising 3 girls, and I keep saying 3, because there's a lot of things happening in our house, right? And there's a lot that we're trying to do and instill in them, both this ability to be independent and chase your dreams, and you don't need a man, you can go forth by yourself, and also this, but you do, there's a certain role and place that you have, and what does it look like in your father, right, in my husband, and in our little sphere, wanting to be able to show and teach my girls, right, and that my husband model for them what a man should be doing for them. And so for us, even now, my girls are 11, 8, and 1, and so they can't really appreciate the extent of sacrificial love, right? They know they've got mommy who is a psychiatrist, right, and they've got daddy who works on computers, but they can't appreciate, the near decade that daddy was single parenting so that mommy could get to and through school, right? That the sacrifices that he was making so I could get to the place that I was, and the sacrifices that he makes day in and day out so I can continue in that space and we can really keep our family together. They can't really appreciate that, but it's there. And so kind of in that little sphere, recognizing that as a church, right, we certainly need to be able to outwardly model this in a better way. In our spheres, within our walls, within our homes, within our contexts, right, there's so much space to have an effect and a positive effect on the young women and young girls in your lives, the daughters, nieces, grandchildren, right, and the young men in your lives, as to what that is supposed to look like simply by living that out in the relationships around you, right? And so I think that sometimes we jump so far to well, how do we make it big so that everyone can see it, when really the work is happening when you wake up, with the people in your home, the people in your space, and what does it start to look like there to model this sacrificial love for the men, and what does it look like to model this respect, from the women?
I feel like Gerald gave us the answer to this in his talk when you were talking about the Christian revolution that happened. You said it wasn't a moment that it impacted the world. It was a slow, steady discipleship process, discipling the next generations, discipling one another. And truly, I imagine so much of this will be the slow, steady progression of disciple making in our lives and in our world.
Yeah, and I think, part of it is, like, if someone has a narrative that Christianity has been bad for women, and that is their narrative, I think the best way you can debunk that is hopefully you bring them into a community like this where they don't see it being bad for women. What they see it actually being is life-giving for women. And so you have to model it. I think that's the point you're making. So, like, whether it's modeling it just in the little nucleus of your own little family, or modeling it here in our family, and then by God's grace that the church learns how to increasingly model it just globally in its context with the sort of ministries, Debbie, that the churches you work with and Hope are doing, right? And we're not all going to do it perfectly in our own little homes. We're not going to do it perfectly at Calvary or beyond, but to live into that reality, I think is so important.
All right, Bethany.
Hello. My name is Bethany. And I have kind of two-part questions, too. First of all, I would like to know if you could define what is biblical womanhood, if you can do that in a short period
Easy
of time.
one. You've got it.
And along with that, how is it different or more valuable than what the world is currently offering us? Thank you.
Thank you, Bethany.
I love all my young adults so much.
That's you. I believe that one of you guys. Yeah.
Oh, curses. Okay. So this feels like a definition in progress because the versions I've told have been wildly inadequate, and the versions that have been modeled for me over the years have excessively so. But one of the things I think that is part of biblical womanhood that is unique to womanhood is the gift of bearing life into the world. And I don't mean that exclusively biologically. I mean that a woman, and here I'm borrowing from Jay Budziszewski in a book called On the Meaning of Sex, which is an incredible book. He notes that you can say a lot of things that are typical of women, but you always have outliers. But when you try to boil it down to its base, a woman is of the sex and gender that has the potential of being a mother. And that he describes as this sort of orientation of all that you do, whether or not it's ever biologically conceived, in whatever form that takes, because in your body you experience life and death and the bearing of life very differently than a man. And one of the things that the models of womanhood, to get to your second question, in terms of the secular narrative, has been, can we erase or diminish and overcome what makes us fundamentally women, such that we can operate beyond our own cycles, such that we can operate in spite of, let's be able to, again, I'm going to return to, let's have sex like a man, where you deny the reality of you alone in the world bear a womb. Whether or not that womb works as it should, or works properly, or functions in any meaningful way. And an affirmation of that is a gift such that I experience life and death differently than a man experiences life and death. And the gift is we tell one another about the world in very unique ways. And if I attempt to overcome that, I deny the thing that most fundamentally makes me a woman. And I deny the gift of mothering the world. I mean, Genesis is described that Eve is called Eve because she was the mother of all living. And when they talk about Mary, her response to the Lord is, "Do unto me, I your maidservant." And it's talked about, Eastern Orthodoxy, they talk about Mary as the picture of discipleship. She alone says to the Lord, "Do unto me." And we learn from a woman in Scripture what it means to respond to God and to bear life, which is the gift then of calling her the mother of God in our theology. So I could go on a fairly long rant of, sorry, but part of it is I think is because all of the ways that we do not surrender to being a woman means that we deny to one another the opportunity to enact that. And we continually tell one another, be closer to a man, or be better men, or look most closely like in your rhythms, in your careers, in all that you do, look most closely like what you are not. And you will be continually frustrated and fragmented by who you are not. And the men will continually be unchecked because they remain and will just come be like us. And neither of us teach to one another the gift of our own sex as men and women. Okay, someone else talk.
That's so good.
This is my favorite Ray topic, so ask her more questions about this. I love it.
Do you want to?
I'll just say a very simple, it's very, and you'll expound more, but at its essence, biblical womanhood is not defining womanhood by our own means, but looking to the Bible to define what it means to be a woman. And we already have acknowledged that there are different interpretations even within looking in the Bible. But at least we can say, at the very minimum, that a biblical woman or biblical womanhood is seeking to define myself and my womanhood by the truth of revealed Scripture.
So I would say that the world tells me to be the best version of a woman. It means that I can do it all by myself, in my own strength. I don't need the help or the resources of anyone else, because if you were like the most super woman that you could be, you would be capable of doing it. So that means that, you know, I could have a baby on Monday and be back at work on Friday, and I can, you know, hold down my household by myself. I can make my own money, forge my own career, and I don't need anyone's help, nor do I need anyone's love. I don't need anyone's safety or security. Like, the world tells me to be the best version of woman means that I have embodied all of those things and I am rocking it out, and I'm not tired, ever, actually. I'm never tired. And that is vastly different than the womanhood that I find in Christ, because Christ expects me to lean on him, and there are very specific needs that I am supposed to have that nothing can fill, and I will be tired if I do it on my own, and quite frankly, I am tired even when I'm trying to do it with Christ, right? And there's nothing wrong with that, and biblical womanhood allows me room to need the things that I need, to need the security, to need the love, to need the safety, to have all of those fundamental needs, and then have an answer to where, like, how those needs are going to be met, right? Versus, if you don't do it this way, says Instagram, Pinterest, Facebook, TikTok, whatever other social media, if you don't do it this way and have done it to this degree, then quite frankly, you haven't met the threshold of like being a real woman, right? And that's just not what it is in biblical womanhood. So I would say that that's how I conceptualize it.
So good. So good.
All right. Great job. That was amazing, wasn't it? I'm like, oh, I could do that for a long time. Thank you, guys. Oh, man.
So good.
I want to thank Gerald. Thank you so much for making this a conversation we're having here. For these wonderful women and their wisdom and just the gifts that you are to this community and the embodiment of modeling to the next generation and to us what this looks like. And for all of you guys for coming this evening. Again, we gave a little preview, but if you enjoyed this, which I have no doubts that you did, that we are going to be doing something like this again. I think Gerald has come up with a very exciting title called Donuts and Discussion.
That's not the title of the lecture. That's the
title of the event. That's what I've written on my page right here. We are having a donuts and discussion.
The history of donuts and discussion. In the Greco-Roman world up until
the topic, it sounds like the topic is going to be on ordination and some of these topics around within the church. How do we think about women and their spaces of leaderships or roles, etc. Some of the terminology that we use in this conversation.
With the reappearance of Christy and Ray, we'll be also involved in that.
Yes, we will be involved in that. And so we are going to be having that on February 11th. Saturday morning it is, and so we'd love to invite you back out for that. You'll be hearing more about that. But thank you guys so much for coming. I'm sure they're available to talk more if you have any further questions, but I hope you have a great night.
Now the curse, it has been broken. Jesus paid the price for me, for the pardon he offered. Great the welcome that I receive. Boldly I approach my Father, clothed in Jesus' righteousness. There is no more guilt to carry. It was finished upon that cross. Death was once my great opponent. Fear once I